proposition, the morning sun fractured into 1,000 shimmering coins on the surface of the Pacific. A dazzling display that Alara Vance ignored completely. Her world was 15 feet below, a realm of muted blues and greens where the only sound was the steady, calming rhythm of her own breath through the regulator. At 27, she communicated more easily with a curious octopus or a school of sardines than with most people. Her focus was absolute, gloved hands steady as she adjusted the camera mounted on a fragile branch of staghorn coral, documenting its faint but promising signs of recovery. Surfacing beside the research vessel, she pushed her mask onto her forehead, blinking salt water from her eyes. Her assistant Leo offered a hand to haul her aboard, his face alight with an energy that had nothing to do with the morning's dive. "You will not believe who called while you were playing with the fish," said, his voice tight with excitement. "If it's the university about the budget again, tell them I'm still underwater," Ilara replied, wringing seawater from her long, dark braid. Better, much, much better. It was Julian Thorne's office. Julian Thorne. The name landed with the weight of an anchor. Julian Thorne was not just a billionaire. He was a specter, a ghost in the machine of the tech world. He gave no interviews, appeared at no galas. His company, Thorne Industries, quietly revolutionized sustainable energy and advanced materials, reaping fortunes, while he himself remained an enigma. "Why would Julian Thorne be calling our little boat?" she asked, skepticism layering her tone. "Because he wants to fund the living daylights out of our project, that's why." His new philanthropic arm, the Prometheus Foundation, is looking for groundbreaking environmental initiatives. He asked for the lead scientist personally. "That's you, Alara. He wants a meeting. Today." A knot of anxiety tightened in Alara's stomach. She was a woman of data and depth charts, not boardrooms and billionaires. "You go, Leo. You're better at the talking," he asked. "For the lead scientist," Leo repeated, his expression serious. "This isn't a negotiation. It's a summons. This is the kind of money that doesn't just fund a project, Alara. It changes the world. Your work could actually change the world." 3 hours later, Ilara stood in the silent, soaring elevator of the Thorne Industries tower, her reflection in the brushed steel looking pale and out of place. She had swapped her wetsuit for a simple, elegant dress of deep emerald green, the color of ocean depths. Her portfolio felt like a lead weight in her hands, filled with years of research, of passion, of her entire life's purpose, now to be, laid before a man who probably saw it as a line item on a spreadsheet. The elevator doors opened not into a reception area, but directly into an office. It was a breathtaking space, all cool gray tones and floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of the city and the sea beyond. It was stark, beautiful, and utterly lonely. And there, standing with his back to her, was the man himself. Julian Thorne was taller than she'd imagined, his frame lean but powerful beneath a exquisitely tailored suit. His posture was not one of relaxation, but of contained energy, like a predator perfectly still before the strike. When he turned, the breath caught in Alara's throat. His hair was the color of dark sand, his features sharp and intelligent, but it was his eyes that held her a pale, piercing gray, the color of a winter sea, and they assessed her with an intensity that felt physical, stripping away her professional composure in an instant. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the spacious room. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." He didn't move to shake her hand, merely gestured to a minimalist sofa facing the view. "Your work on utilizing specific bacterial strains to promote coral calcification is exceptional." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she managed, her voice thankfully steady. She sat back straight and launched into her prepared presentation. She spoke of acidification, of thermal bleaching, of the delicate symbiotic relationships within the reef. He listened, utterly still, those stormy eyes fixed on her, interrupting only to ask questions that were so insightful they revealed a formidable intellect meeting her on her own scientific ground. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the ocean. "It's a worthy fight," he said finally. "But I have to wonder what drives someone to dedicate their life to a battle most of the world ignores." The personal question threw her. The ocean is honest. It doesn't lie or pretend. It just is. And what's happening to it is the greatest tragedy no one is watching. Suppose I fight for it because it can't fight for itself." He turned those gray eyes back on her, and for a fleeting second, she saw something in them she recognized, a profound solitude. "We both understand building something of substance in a world that prefers shallow waters," he said, his voice quieter now. The conversation drifted from science to philosophy to the burden of vision. He spoke of building his company from a garage, of the isolation of success, of the impossibility of trusting anyone. She found herself telling him about losing her parents, about burying herself in her studies, about the quiet judgment she felt from a world that found her too intense, too dedicated, too strange. The afternoon light began to soften, painting the room in gold. The business meeting had evaporated hours ago. "Have dinner with me," he said abruptly. The request was a current pulling her into deep water, Mr. Thorne. "Julian," he corrected softly. "Julian, this grant, your foundation's board. The grant is approved, 1.2 million. Annually, for 10 years, with option for renewal." Ilar's mind went blank. It was more money than she'd dared to dream of. I don't know what to say. But say you'll have dinner with me. There's something else I wish to discuss. Something of a more personal nature." Against every instinct that told her to flee, she nodded. "All right." He took her to a small, discreet restaurant tucked away in a cobblestone alley. A place that knew him by name and asked for no menu. Over wine that tasted like sunlight and food that tasted like heaven, the strange intimacy of the afternoon deepened. And then he set his glass down, his expression turning grave. "Ilara, the reason I sought you out specifically is twofold. Your work is, as I said, exceptional, but you are also like anyone in my orbit. You have a clarity and authenticity that is extinct in my world." He took a breath. "I am 35 years old. I have built an empire, but I have no heir. No legacy beyond quarterly reports." Cold dread began to pool in her stomach. "There are many options for someone in your position. I don't want a surrogate hired by a lawyer. I don't want a transaction. I want a child with a woman of intelligence, integrity, and strength. I want a partner in parenthood, if not in the conventional sense. We would share custody. You would want for nothing. Your work would be funded in perpetuity. The child would have 2 devoted parents." The world tilted on its axis. Ilara gripped the edge of the table. "You're asking me to have a child with you?" "I am proposing a partnership, a marriage, for appearance and legal simplicity. We would live separately, lead our own lives, but come together to raise the child." She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "This is insane. We met 5 hours ago. I've read every paper you've published. I've followed your career for 2 years. I know your character better than I knew my last board member after a decade. And you." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "You feel this too, this connection. Don't dismiss it because it's unfamiliar." Heat flooded her cheeks. He was right. The attraction was a live wire between them, humming with a terrifying voltage. "Even if I were to entertain this madness, there are things you don't know. I'm not experienced with men, with any of this." The confession was torn from her, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. Instead of the shock or disdain she expected, his gaze softened with something that looked like reverence. "Ilara," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "That doesn't diminish you. Makes the prospect of being with you all the more compelling." The drive back to her modest apartment was silent, the air in the car thick with unspoken words. He walked her to her door. As she fumbled for her keys, his hand covered hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure sensation that shot straight up her arm and stole her breath. She looked up, and his face was inches from hers, his gray eyes dark with a wanting that mirrored the sudden, aching emptiness inside her. "Think about it," he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of her hand once, gently. Before releasing it, she fled inside, leaning against the closed door, her entire body trembling. The shy, untouched scientist who spoke the language of fish was being offered a lifetime of security for her work, a child, and a taste of a passion she'd only read about. All she had to do was say yes to the most impossible proposition imaginable. And as she slid down to the floor, her heart pounding, she was terrified to realize that the answer wasn't immediately no. The silence in her apartment was deafening, a stark contrast to the roaring conflict in her mind. For 3 days, Ilara moved through her life like a ghost. The ocean, her usual sanctuary, offered no comfort. Every dive felt like a betrayal, as if the water itself was waiting for her decision. The grant paperwork sat unsigned on her small kitchen table, a siren's call of everything she had ever wanted professionally. Tethered to a personal madness, Leo watched her with worried eyes, finally cornering her in the lab. "You've been cataloging the same sample for an hour. It's a piece of gravel, Ilara. Talk to me. What did the Recluse King do? Withdraw the offer?" "No," she said, her voice hollow. "The offer is still there. It's just more complicated than I thought." "How complicated can a grant be? Sign the paper, cash the check, save the world." If only it were that simple. The memory of Julian's hand on hers, the intensity in his stormy eyes, the sheer audacity of his proposal played on a loop in her mind. She had built her life on logic, on empirical data, on the predictable rhythms of nature. This was chaos. This was a leap into an abyss. On the evening of the 3rd day, as she sat on her floor surrounded by research papers she couldn't focus on, her phone lit up. His name appeared on the screen. A fresh jolt of electricity went through her. She let it ring 3 times, her breath held before answering. Ilara. Just the way he said her name, low and deliberate, made her skin prickle. "Julian, I've given you space, but I find myself impatient. Have you thought about my proposal?" "I've thought of little else," she admitted, the words tasting like a confession. "May I come over? We should discuss the particulars." An hour later, he was at her door again. This time, he wore dark jeans and a simple black sweater that made him seem less like a corporate titan and more like a man. It was, if possible, even more disarming. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over her space with a curiosity that felt intrusive and flattering all at once. He paused at her bookshelf, his fingers trailing over the spines of well-worn marine biology texts and classic novels. "You live a life of purpose," he observed, turning to her. "It's refreshing. It's quiet," she corrected, hugging her arms around herself. "Quiet isn't empty." He moved to the sofa, sitting and gesturing for her to join him. The small space forced them into proximity, his knee almost brushing hers. She could smell his cologne, something clean and sharp like ozone after a storm. "Tell me your questions." She had prepared a list, a defensive wall of practicality. "If I were to agree, how would it work? Legally, logistically, logistically. Would the child live? How would decisions be made?" He didn't hesitate. "We would marry. Simplifies everything. Custody, inheritance, medical decisions. The child would split time equally between us. I would, of course, provide homes for you both that meet your needs and ensure your complete privacy and security. We would create a shared, legally binding parenting plan outlining all major decisions. Healthcare, religion. We would meet regularly as co-parents to discuss their well-being." It was so cold, so clinical, yet the way he said, the child held a warmth, a reverence that belied the sterile language. "And us?" The question slipped out, soft and vulnerable, his gaze intensified, locking with hers. "What about us? This attraction you mentioned. Where does that fit into this business arrangement?" Her heart was hammering again. She was venturing into deep, uncharted water. A slow, deliberate smile touched his lips. "It doesn't have to fit anywhere. It can simply be. We can ignore it if you prefer." Or, he leaned forward, closing the small distance between them. His voice dropped to a whisper. "We can explore it, see where it leads." Real Ilara. In the eyes of the law, and behind closed doors, if we both wish it, I find the prospect of a real marriage with you increasingly preferable to a simple arrangement. His honesty was devastating, stripped away her defenses. He wasn't just offering a contract, he was offering a path. A terrifying, exhilarating path I've never. I don't know how to be someone's wife, she whispered, her fears laid bare, and I don't know how to be a husband. We would learn together. Let me court you, Alara. Properly. Let me show you the man I am when I'm not trying to negotiate a deal. Against the screaming voice of her rationality, she heard her own voice, small but clear, say, yes, there. First official date was the next night. He didn't take her to a famed, impossible-to-get-into restaurant. He drove them up the coast to a cliffside inn she'd passed 100 times but never visited. The food was simple, spectacularly fresh seafood, and the owner, a weathered woman named Martha, treated Julian like a favorite nephew. My mother brought me here when I was a boy, he explained, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. It was one of the few places she could relax. It's real here. It's overshared dessert and a bottle of rich, dark wine, he told her more. About his mother's long illness, the way it had carved his father into a bitter, distant man, obsessed with legacy. He spoke of the crushing weight of expectation, building his company not for glory but to prove he was nothing like his father. He told her about the one serious relationship he'd had, the socialite named Serafina, who had been photographed leaving his rival's penthouse the week after Julian had confided a crucial business strategy to her. After that, emotion was a liability. Connection was a weakness to be exploited. I built walls, until I read a paper by a brilliant, stubborn scientist who wrote about coral reefs with more passion than most people have for their own children. I saw a reflection of my own intensity, but without the cynicism, it captivated me. Lara found herself sharing her own story in return. The quiet, bookish child who preferred tide pools to people. The devastating loss of her parents that had left her and her younger brother, Sam, adrift. The years of struggle to keep Sam in school, to build a career from nothing but sheer will and intellect. She told him of the loneliness that was a constant companion, even in her beloved sea. You could have asked for help with Sam, he said quietly. The foundation has scholarships. That's why I didn't, she said, meeting his gaze. I need to know that any feeling between us is real, not born from gratitude or obligation. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His skin was warm, his touch firm. Alara, what I feel for you is the most real thing I've experienced in a decade. Has nothing to do with your brother. After dinner, they walked along the deserted beach, the only light coming from the moon and the stars reflected in the wet sand. The air was cool, and he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was so simple, so instinctively protective, that it undid her completely. He stopped walking and turned to face her. The moonlight silvered his features, making him look both ethereal and utterly solid. I meant what I said, Alara. This isn't just about the arrangement for me anymore. It's these past few days. I haven't been able to think of anything but you. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His touch was gentle, questioning. Tell me to stop, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She couldn't. She was mesmerized. She rose onto her toes, closing the final inch between them. His kiss was not what she expected. It wasn't demanding or possessive. It was slow, achingly tender, exploration. It was a question and an answer. Her first kiss. And it shattered her completely. Her hands came up to clutch his sweater, holding on as the world tilted. When he finally drew back, both of them were breathing raggedly. Was that? He began, his forehead resting against hers. My first, she finished, her voice trembling. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder crossed his face. Then I am truly honored, he murmured, before kissing her again. This time with a hint of the passion he'd been holding back. A week later, in a quiet courthouse with only Leo and a stern-faced lawyer as witnesses, Alara Vance became Alara. Thorne, she wore a cream-colored suit. He wore a dark gray one. They exchanged simple gold bands. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, now Julian's kiss was brief, soft, and filled with a promise that made her knees weak. They drove to his penthouse in a silence thick with anticipation and tension. The reality of their situation crashed down on her. She was in his space now, stunning minimalist apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. Her small suitcase by the door looked absurd. "This is your home now," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Make it ours. Change anything you want." He showed her to a bedroom adjacent to his own. "This is yours. Always. No one will ever pressure you, Alara, especially not me. We move at your pace." That night, lying alone in the vast, unfamiliar bed, Alara listened to the silence of the penthouse. She was married to a stranger, a beautiful, brilliant, complicated stranger who had kissed her with a tenderness that had rewired her soul. The transaction had been made, but as she drifted to sleep, the memory of his lips on hers was the only thing that felt real. The partnership had begun, but the lines between business and pleasure, between arrangement and affection, had already become beautifully, terrifyingly blurred. The first week of their marriage unfolded with a strange, formal cadence. They were two satellites orbiting the same sterile star, their paths crossing with polite, measured distance. Julian left for his offices before dawn. Alara, unnerved by the silent, art-filled expanse of the penthouse, escaped to the familiar chaos of the research vessel. They met for dinner, meals prepared by a chef who came and went like a ghost, their conversations a careful dance around work, science, and current events, everything except the elephant in the room, which was the fact that they were husband and wife who slept in separate bedrooms. The tension was a living thing, thickening the air between them. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her a second too long when she explained a point about coral polyps, in the accidental brush of his hand against hers when he passed the salt, in the charged silence that fell when they said goodnight. At their respective doors, Alara felt like she was constantly holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the transactional nature of their arrangement to reassert itself. But it didn't. Instead, a quiet, persistent courtship continued. He filled her private bathroom with expensive, sea-scented bath oils. He had a state-of-the-art workstation for her installed in a spare room, with monitors that could link directly to the Institute's data streams. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke, his intelligent questions pushing her to think about her work in new ways. He was building a gilded cage, but he was leaving the door wide open, waiting for her to choose to walk in. The breaking point came on Friday. Julian stood in the doorway of her bedroom as she was getting ready for another day at the lab. "Cancel. Your plans for the weekend," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, yet his eyes held a glimmer of something else, anticipation. "Why?" she asked, her guard instantly up. "We're going away. The Prometheus Foundation has a pet project. A private marine research station on a remote island in the San Juans. It needs assessing. I thought you'd be the perfect consultant." A faint smile played on his lips. "Consider it a working honeymoon." Resistance was on her tongue, but the words marine research station disarmed her completely. 4 hours later, a private helicopter was whisking them away from the steel and glass city toward a tapestry of emerald islands and sapphire water. The station was a revelation. It was a modern, low-slung home built of glass and weathered cedar, clinging to a rocky bluff overlooking a secluded cove. It was surrounded by untouched wilderness, the air smelling of salt and pine. Attached to the main house was a fully equipped lab that made her institute's setup look antiquated. "This is incredible," Alara breathed, her nose practically pressed against the lab's glass wall, staring at the sonar array and DNA sequencers. "It's yours," Julian said simply, coming to stand beside her. "If you want it. A place where you can work without interruption. A sanctuary." The word hung between them. Sanctuary, it was what the ocean had always been for her, and he was offering her a piece of it. The gesture was so profoundly understanding that it left her speechless. She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. The formality of the penthouse evaporated in the wildness of the island. Julian swapped his suits for worn jeans and sweaters. He helped her haul equipment down to the water's edge, his city-pale skin flushing in the cool air. He was clumsy with the kayak, all long limbs and uncoordinated effort. And the sight of the powerful, controlled Julian Thorne, laughing as he nearly capsized, sent a strange, warm flutter through Alara's chest. That evening, They built a fire in the great stone fireplace. He opened a bottle of wine, and they sat on the thick rug, the flames painting dancing shadows on the walls. The conversation, for the first time, turned away from science and business and towards childhood dreams, forgotten hobbies, silly fears. He told her about trying to build a raft as a boy and sinking immediately in his parents' pool. She confessed her irrational fear of geese. They laughed, the sound echoing in the spacious room, and it felt real, unforgettable. The wine warmed her, and the proximity to him, the sheer magnetism of him, became a palpable force. She was hyper-aware of every shift of his body, every glance from those storm-gray eyes. The careful walls she'd built were crumbling, washed away by the honesty of this place and the man he was revealing himself to be. "Thank you," she said softly, staring into the fire. For understanding that I need this." She gestured to the windows, to the dark, wild ocean beyond. "I see you, Elara," he said, his voice low and intense. "I think I saw you before I even met you." He moved then, not with suddenness, but with a deliberate, slow grace that stole the air from her lungs. He shifted closer on the rug, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheekbone. His eyes searched hers, asking a silent, urgent question. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to pull away, to retreat behind the safe, clinical terms of their contract. But a stronger, newer instinct won out. This was no longer about a contract. This was about the look in his eyes, the tenderness of his touch, the connection that had been growing between them since the moment they met. It was about the terrifying, the thrilling free fall of wanting someone. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was all the answer he needed. His kiss was different from the one on the beach that had been a question, a discovery. This was an affirmation. It was deep, hungry, and filled with a raw need that she felt echoed in the very core of her being. It was a kiss that spoke of weeks of pent-up desire, of a loneliness that recognized its match. She kissed him back with a fervor that surprised them both, her fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. World narrowed to the feel of his lips on hers, his hands sliding from her face to her back, pressing her against the solid strength of his body. The crackle of the fire was the only sound besides their ragged breathing. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes dark with a passion that made her tremble. "Tell me this is what you want," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Tell me to stay." Her voice was a whisper, but it was sure. "Stay." He stood, and in one fluid motion, scooped her up into his arms. She gasped, clinging to his neck, burying her face in the warmth of his sweater as he carried her through the dimly lit house, not to her assigned guest room, but to the master bedroom. The room was all dark wood and glass, with a breathtaking view of the star-strewn sky over the water. He set her down gently beside the large bed, his hands framing her face once more. "We don't have to," he began, but she silenced him with a kiss, her own hands fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. Her inexperience was evident, but her desire was not. It was a language her body understood instinctively. He took over, his movements slow and reverent. He undressed her with a patience that felt like worship, kissing each new inch of skin he revealed. When she stood before him, bathed in the moonlight, she felt no shame, only a powerful sense of rightness. He shed his own clothes and her breath. Caught at the sight of him, all lean muscle and taut skin, a beautiful, powerful male form, he laid her back on the cool sheets, his body covering hers, not with crushing weight but with a protective heat. He whispered her name like a prayer against her skin as he mapped her body with his hands and mouth, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch against him, teaching her about a pleasure she had only ever read about. When he finally joined them together, there was a brief, sharp pain that made her cry out. But he stilled, holding her close, murmuring soothing words against her ear until it faded, placed by a building, overwhelming sensation of fullness and connection. He began to move, a slow, deep rhythm that felt less like a physical act and more like a conversation. a joining of souls as much as bodies. She wrapped her legs around him, meeting his rhythm, losing herself in the feel of him, in the raw emotion. In his eyes as he watched her, the outside world, the arrangement, the reasons, it all melted away. There was only this, him, her, them. Her climax crashed over her like a wave, pulling a broken sob from her throat. He followed moments after, his own release a groan of her name as he buried his face in her neck, his body shuddering against hers. Afterward, lay tangled in the sheets, limbs intertwined, the sound of the ocean a gentle lullaby through the open window. Hurt close, one hand possessively on her hip, the other stroking her hair. No words were spoken, none were needed. The contract had been signed in a courthouse, but their real marriage had been sealed in that firelit room. Under the watchful stars, Elara lay awake long after his breathing had evened out into sleep. She traced the lines of his shoulder in the moonlight, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The transaction was over. Something real had begun. And for the first time since he'd made his outrageous proposal, she felt no fear, only a thrilling, terrifying hope for what their future might hold. The world had shifted on its axis. The return to the city after their island interlude was jarring. The sterile penthouse now felt different, charged with the memory of the intimacy they'd shared. The separate bedrooms became a technicality, not a boundary. Most nights, Alara fell asleep in the circle of Julian's arms in his room, or he in hers, their bodies finding a familiar, comfortable fit as if they'd been sleeping together for years. The change was subtle but profound. The polite distance was replaced by easy touch, huzzah hand on the small of her back as he passed her in the kitchen. Her head resting on his shoulder as they read on the sofa, his lips brushing her temple for no reason at all. He started leaving, later for work, lingering over coffee to hear her plans for the day. She found herself waiting for the sound of his key in the lock in the evening, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. It was during one of these quiet mornings, 2 weeks after their return, that the first tremor hit. Alara was sipping her tea, watching the fog burn off the city, when a wave of nausea so violent it stole her breath washed over her. She barely made it to the bathroom. Julian was at her side in an instant, his face pale with a fear she'd never seen there. "Alara, what's wrong?" His hand was cool on her forehead. "I'm fine," she gasped, though she felt far from it. "Must be something I ate." But the sickness returned the next morning, and the next. Deep bone-weary fatigue settled over her, making the thought of a dive feel like a marathon. Leo noticed her pallor and her sudden aversion to the strong coffee she usually lived on. "You look like hell," he said bluntly one afternoon in the lab. "Are you sick? Is it the pressure of all that billionaire wife stuff?" He waggled his eyebrows, but his concern was genuine. A cold, dawning realization began to push through the fog of her nausea. Her cycle was late, terribly late. In the whirlwind of the marriage in the island and the seismic shift in her relationship with Julian, she hadn't even noticed. Panic, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. They hadn't used protection on the island. It hadn't even crossed her mind. The concept was so foreign to her inexperienced world, and the moment had felt too primal, too inevitable for such practical concerns. She bought a test on her way home, her hands shaking so badly she could barely swipe her credit card. Back in the penthouse's vast marble bathroom, she followed the instructions with the focused intensity of a lab protocol, her heart hammering against her ribs. The result appeared faster than she thought possible. 2 bold, unequivocal lines, pregnant. The word echoed in the silent, sterile room. She sank onto the cold floor, the little plastic stick clattering from her fingers. This was the goal, wasn't it? The entire purpose of their arrangement. The heir, the legacy. She should be relieved. It had happened quickly, naturally, avoiding the clinical coldness of a doctor's office. But all she felt was a blind, terrified vertigo. It was too fast. They were just beginning to discover each other. What if this changed everything? What if the pressure, the reality of it, shattered the delicate, beautiful thing growing between them? What if he saw this only as a successful outcome of his business plan, and not as the miracle it felt like to her? She heard his key in the door, his familiar footsteps in the hallway. "Ilara, I'm home." His voice was warm, happy. She couldn't move. She just sat on the floor, staring at the wall. He found her there. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by that same raw fear from days before. He was on his knees beside her in a second. "Ilara, talk to me. What's wrong? Are you ill? Should I call a doctor?" His hands framed her face, forcing her to look at him. Tears she hadn't even felt starting welled in her eyes and spilled over. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, the words sounding alien and terrifying. His face went utterly still. One heart-stopping second, she saw nothing, no emotion, no reaction. It was the impenetrable mask of Julian Thorne, the billionaire, and her heart shattered. She had been right. The dream was over then. Slowly, like the sun breaking through a storm cloud, a light dawned in his gray eyes. A wonder so profound it made him look like a different man. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, transforming it completely. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her chest. He was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "We're having a baby." He pulled back, his hands cradling her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Why are you crying? This is everything." I was scared. She choked. "Out, I thought. I thought you'd just see it as the deal being fulfilled." His expression softened into something so tender it made her ache. The deal was for an heir. He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "This is our child, yours and mine, created from what happened on that island. That wasn't part of any deal, Ilara. That was us." The truth of his words washed over her, soothing the fear, leaving only a trembling, incredible joy in its wake. She laughed through her tears, throwing her arms around his neck. He lifted her off the floor, spinning her around in the spacious bathroom, their laughter echoing off the marble. The joy was infectious, but short-lived. The next tremor hit from the outside world. The following morning, a glossy tabloid was waiting on the breakfast table, delivered by a staff member who wouldn't meet Ilara's eye. The headline was in massive, garish type: "Thorne's secret baby bump. Exclusive billionaire knocks up mystery marine biologist and shotgun wedding." Beside the headline was a photo of Ilara, looking pale and queasy, leaving her doctor's office from 2 days prior. The article was a vicious piece of speculation, painting her as a cunning scientist who had trapped the elusive billionaire, questioning the timing of the marriage and dredging up old photoshopped pictures of Julian with Serafina. Ilara's blood ran cold. The violation was absolute, suffocating. Julian's reaction was a controlled inferno. He didn't rage. He went very, very still, his eyes turning to chips of ice. He picked up his phone and issued a series of quiet, deadly commands to his legal and security teams. But the damage was done. The vultures were circling. Photographers camped outside the research institute, disrupting work and frightening the marine life Ilara was trying to study. Leo had to physically block one from following her onto the dock. Her quiet, purposeful life had been splashed across the gutter press for entertainment. The final seismic shock came not from the tabloids, but from the boardroom. A rival tech firm, Ethon Industries, led by a ruthlessly ambitious man named Cassian Vale, saw Julian's sudden marriage and pregnancy as a sign of distraction, of weakness. Using the tabloid frenzy as a smokescreen, Ethon launched a hostile takeover bid for Thorne Industries. Julian was suddenly plunged into a war on two fronts, protecting his wife from the predatory media and fighting to save the company he'd built from a corporate raider. The man who had been tender and present vanished, replaced by a grim, overworked strategist who spent 18 hours a day on the phone or in his study. His face etched with stress, Ilara felt him slipping away, pulled back into the lonely, pressurized world he'd inhabited before her. The romantic dinners ceased. Their easy mornings vanished. He was there, but he wasn't. The beautiful connection they'd forged felt fragile, threatened by the very world he came from. One night she found him asleep at his desk, his head resting on a stack of financial reports, his face looking exhausted and young. Her heart ached. She gently shook him awake. "Julian, come to bed." He blinked, disoriented, the stress immediately snapping back into place on his features. "I can't. I have to go over these numbers again." "Veil is Julian," she interrupted, her voice firm. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "This is what matters. This is the only legacy that's unbreakable. Let them have a piece of the company if you have to. Don't let them have you. Don't let them have us." He looked from her determined face down to his hand on her womb, where their future was growing. The hard corporate mask finally cracked, and she saw the terrified, overwhelmed man beneath. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against her stomach, his shoulders slumping in defeat and exhaustion. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice muffled. "How to fight him and protect you and be what you both need." "Don't have to do it alone," she whispered, running her fingers through his hair. "That was the deal, remember? Partners?" He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw the storm beginning to clear. The foundation of their carefully constructed arrangement had been shaken, but the real emotional foundation they had built was still standing. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the chaos began, they would face it not as separate entities bound by a contract, but as a united front. The ultrasound room was warm, the lights dimmed. A different kind of tension filled the air now, not of business or hostile takeovers, but of pure, breathless anticipation. Ilara lay on the table, the cool gel on her stomach, her hand clenched tightly in Julian's. His thumb stroked calming circles on her skin, but she could feel the fine tremor in his fingers. The technician, a cheerful woman named Anita, moved the wand with practiced ease. "All right, let's take a look at your little one," Anita said, her eyes on the monitor. A fuzzy, grand white image flickered to life. Rapid, galloping sound filled the room, a heartbeat, strong and sure. Ilara felt Julian's grip tighten, heard his sharp intake of breath. A tear escaped and traced a path down his temple into his hairline. He didn't wipe it away. "There's your baby," Anita smiled. "Perfect size for 14 weeks. Nice and active-o." She paused, her cursor hovering over the screen. She moved the wand slightly, pressing a little deeper. Her smile widened into something truly beatific. "Well, would you look at that?" "What is it?" Julian's voice was tight with instant concern. "Is something wrong?" "Oh, nothing's wrong," Anita chuckled. "Not at all. See here?" She pointed to one distinct, curled shape. "This is baby A." She moved the cursor. "And this is baby B. You're not having one little one. You're having two." The world stopped. The sound of the heartbeats seemed to swell, filling the entire universe. "Two." The word echoed in the silent room. Julian made a sound unlike anything Ilara had ever heard, a choked sob of pure, unadulterated shock and joy. He bent over, his forehead resting on their joined hands, his shoulders shaking. "Twins," he whispered against her skin, the word a prayer. Ilara could only stare at the screen, at the two tiny, separate beings she carried. The fear she'd initially felt was utterly obliterated, washed away by a tidal wave of awe so profound it left her weightless. Two heartbeats, two lives, their lives. The ride home was a daze. Julian couldn't stop smiling, his hand permanently resting on her knee. "A boy and a girl," he kept saying, marveling at the technician's early guess. "We'll need another nursery, bigger car. We should look at that property in the San Juans. More space, better air." His mind was already building, planning, protecting. But the frantic energy from the corporate battle was gone, replaced by a focused, joyful purpose. The news had recalibrated his entire world. The fallout from the tabloid story and Ethon takeover attempt continued, but it now seemed to happen on the other side of a thick pane of glass. Julian still worked long hours, but he did it from his home office, often with Ilara reading on the sofa nearby. He became ruthless in his strategy, not for victory's sake, but for efficiencies. He wanted it over. One evening, he emerged from his study looking lighter than he had in weeks. He came to sit beside her, taking her hand and placing it on her no-obvious bump. Where their children were performing their evening acrobatics, I spoke to the board, he said quietly, and to Cassian Vale. Alara held her breath. And I let him have it. You lost. The concept was alien when applied to Julian. Double quotes. No, he said, a genuine smile touching his lips. I gave it to him. The energy division, the manufacturing arm, the parts that require constant scrutiny, constant battle. I kept the core research and development, the philanthropic foundation, and the patents. The parts that build the future. Instead of just fighting over the present, he looked at her, his gray eyes clear and peaceful. He thinks he won a prize. But he just bought himself a lifetime of stress and enemies. I bought us our freedom, our peace. Our family doesn't need an empire, Alara. It needs a father. It needs a home. The decision was his final, definitive answer to the question she'd asked him in his study weeks ago. He had chosen them. The San Juan Island property became their permanent home. The research station was expanded into a true family home. Filled with light and the sound of the sea, Lyra's pregnancy progressed, her body rounding with the lives within her. Julian was her constant shadow, massaging her aching back, talking to her belly. His earlier clumsiness replaced by a sure, gentle competence that made her fall in love with him all over again. The final weeks were a slow, uncomfortable eternity. But on a cool spring morning, with the dawn painting the sky in watercolor hues, the waiting ended. The birth was a long, intense journey that Julian never left her side for. His hand crushed in hers, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of pain. Luna arrived first. With a shock of dark hair and her father's stormy eyes, her tiny features set in a look of serene curiosity. Phoenix followed, louder and more impatient. With a thatch of auburn hair and a cry that announced his arrival to the entire world as they were placed in her arms, Alara felt a love so fierce and overwhelming. It was terrifying. She looked up at Julian, who was openly weeping, his face a mask of awe as he looked at his daughter and son. He reached out a trembling finger to stroke Luna's cheek, then Phoenix's tiny fist immediately closed around it. They're perfect, he breathed, his voice raw with emotion. You are perfect. The months that followed were a beautiful, exhausting blur of sleepless nights and first smiles. The penthouse was sold. Thorn Industries, streamlined and focused under Julian's still-sharp guidance, thrived from a distance. Their world narrowed to the rhythms of their children, to the cozy chaos of their island home. One evening, they sat together on the deck, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the water in fiery shades of orange and purple. Luna and Phoenix, now 6 months old, were sleeping contentedly in a shared bassinet between them. Their tiny hands intertwined even in sleep. Julian reached across and took Alira's hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band on her finger. He wanted an heir, he said softly, his gaze on their children. A single, solitary heir to a cold fortune. He looked at her, his eyes soft with a love that had deepened and settled into something unshakable. You gave me a family. You gave me a life. Lara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children sleep. The ocean, her first love, murmured its eternal song against the shore, but her heart, now and forever, belonged to the man beside her and the two perfect sleeping testaments to their unlikely, extraordinary love. The deal had been for an heir, a transaction, but in the end, Julian Thorne had gotten something infinitely more valuable, a legacy not of wealth, but of love, built not on a contract, but on the unshakable foundation of a promise made under the stars and kept every day since.